Suffering is like, it's hard, it's not comfortable for a lot of people, or the thought of it, but in that we discover things about God that the church needs to know, that people need to hear about. Like, it's one thing for, even just in sharing the gospel with an unbeliever, like, it's one thing to say, oh, like, God is, God is all of these things, and it's another thing to be like, I know that because I've lived it. I think it's Revelation somewhere that says, like, we'll overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. And those who have gone through suffering have a unique testimony of God's love, a testimony that is reliable, that's dependable, that's really hard to argue with, because it's not something that's like just intellectual. It's something that's deep and that's heart rooted, heart related. And so because of that, like, it's just really needed, our testimonies, but also, like, there are a lot of actions that we can do even as we are in the stillness, and because of the stillness, or the slowing down of life, or the non-traditional route that you might take. I think it just requires a lot of creativity. I think that one of the best things, if you have a chronic illness, if you know someone who is chronically ill, that you can do is lean into creativity, whether that's in engaging relationally. Maybe you're not going out for coffee, maybe you're coming over for a movie, or maybe you can't meet in person, maybe you can video call, even if you live in the same town. But then when it comes to like opportunities to serve those around you, your gifts are still needed, even if it looks different than what fits into the norm around you, whether that's the normal life rhythms or like the normal church model.
Do you ever wonder where God is at when life is flipped upside down? I'm Sherry, your host, and I created this podcast so that my guests and I could look at the good God we profess through the lens of pain and suffering. What I have learned both firsthand and through the personal stories of my guests is that the God of the Holy Bible speaks beautiful things in the dark. God invites us to give him our pain because he's the only one who can transform the very thing that was meant to destroy us. Our challenge is to trust him in the process so that we might come to understand who he really is versus who we think he should be. Listen in and discover the countless ways in which we can find God in our pain. My guest, Sara Willoughby, is a young woman who is courageously navigating life with chronic illness. Sara's journey is not just a testament to her resilience, but also a beacon of hope for many who find themselves battling similar challenges. Her story underscores the power of faith, the importance of community, and the unexpected beauty that can emerge from suffering. Sara's life took an unexpected turn when she was diagnosed with Lyme disease, multiple chemical sensitivity, and toxic mold poisoning. And her path to diagnosis was long and stressful because of several misdiagnoses and various consultations with 13 doctors. So this prolonged uncertainty and then the eventual diagnosis upended her life, kind of like kept her in a holding pattern. And one facet of her diagnosis of being exposed to mold in her home led to her and her family losing their home and their cherished possessions. Sara's faith has been a cornerstone in her journey. She speaks candidly about the struggles that she faced in reconciling her belief in a loving God with the suffering she endured. She talks about what it means to live a purposeful and fulfilling life in the midst of ongoing uncertainty. Her relationship with God deepened as she allowed herself to ask the difficult questions and seek God for his answers. Despite her limitations, Sara discovered new avenues to serve God and others. Her writing became a powerful tool for ministry, allowing her to connect with a global audience. And through her blog and her book that she wrote, the Diamonds Conference for Christians with Chronic Illnesses, something she founded, Sara has fostered a community where individuals can share their experiences, find resources, and support each other. Sara highlights the unique contributions that those with chronic illness can make to the world and to the church. The slower pace of life, often imposed by illness, offers opportunities for deeper reflection, creativity, and meaningful, purposeful connection, something that I personally feel is no longer prioritized in our society. People are just too busy. And whether through snail mail ministries or prayer or online conferences, Sara emphasizes that those with chronic illness have valuable gifts to share. And throughout her journey, Sara has learned to trust in God's plan, even when it doesn't look like what she personally envisioned for herself. She has seen God resurrect her aspirations in unexpected ways, from publishing the book to serving overseas and marrying a supportive partner. Her story is a powerful reminder that God's love and purpose for us are not diminished by their circumstances. Sarah Willoughby's journey with chronic illness challenges how we naturally want to define, and I'm going to air quote this, normal life. I loved it because the beauty that radiates from her life, the intimacy that she has with the Lord, the significance of a slower pace, the creativeness born out of hitting a wall, per se, it's one of the most beautiful reminders that God uses everything about our life to deliver us into a deeper richness of identity, meaning, purpose, and on countless levels. Sara, I want to welcome you to the show and I want to say thank you for being willing to expose your personal struggles with chronic illness. I know that your courage is bolstered by the fact that you want people to know that they're not alone in their hard questions, any struggles they may have, and even any emotional battles that they might be fighting. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Sherry. This is something that is just so important to talk about. So I love getting to listen to the conversations you have on your podcast.
I immediately gravitated to your story because letting people know that they're not alone is a lifeline. It has literally saved people's lives when they realize someone cares, someone has information that will direct them out of the isolation and loneliness or the places where they get stuck. So, your firsthand knowledge of the challenges that chronic illness presents has provided transformational revelations about who God is in the midst of chronic illness. And that's a super powerful position to have, or at least a revelation to have, that where you grow in intimacy with Christ. Also, I'm looking forward to hearing all of the resources, both from what you've developed as well as other ministries, communities, books, podcasts, etc. I feel sure there's going to be a lot of good news for some people today. Tell us a little bit about your story because you're young. Your passion for God is strong. You were offering your life up to God by way of serving Him. You valued all the things that are near and dear to His heart, missions, marriage, family. What was life like before the diagnosis that would change the direction of your life, undermine every dream and goal you had?
I did get sick when I was quite young. So before that, I don't know, life was pretty bubble wrapped. I loved to hike and swim and adventure with my family and try funky foods and hang out with friends. I actually moved around a lot growing up throughout my life. So I feel like in that there is definitely seasons of loneliness, but it did change once I started to get sick, didn't even have a diagnosis, and then eventually was facing diagnosis and like the long-term aspect of chronic illness.
How did it begin to present itself? What made you think, oh, hold on, something's going on. I got to have this looked into?
I originally had strep throat and a tonsillar abscess. Just like, you're not your average flu, but nothing crazy. But in that my it just like flipped the fragile ecosystem that I didn't know my body was. And so I started to have different things that just weren't normal. I started to just like have a lot of like gut pain and swelling and things like that and like vision problems and just started to like really struggle to think and do my schoolwork and in ways that I had not experienced before. And I knew something wasn't right, but it definitely took time for me to realize just how wrong things were. But over time, new symptoms were added of joint pain, and I was misdiagnosed with things like juvenile rheumatoid arthritis or lupus or other autoimmune diseases. It took like 13 doctors to get diagnosed, just one
Wow.
person passing me to another. And honestly, in the chronic illness world, I know that's actually not that many. Just not being able to get the care or the treatment you need, even if you have a diagnosis.
And I think even today I've noticed, well, especially ever since COVID, you go to the doctor and the doctor, it's not uncommon for them to say, you know what, hey, we really don't know what the problem is. If that's not scary, I don't know what is. So being passed from 13 doctors, and you're saying that's not uncommon or that's a low number?
It's not uncommon, and in some cases it is a low number. I I honestly, my favorite doctors were the ones that said, I don't know. They were really humble in their willingness to research and their willingness to get second opinions. And those were the ones that actually helped me the most were those doctors that said, I don't know. I don't know what's going on, but we're gonna keep trying to figure it out.
That is a gift instead of just hanging on to you and running tests when you really have no clue where you're going with it. So that's a gift when they're ready to say, I don't know, and we need another resource or we need another doctor. So that's good.
Mhm.
Would you want to share what your diagnosis is?
After being passed along from person to person and misdiagnosed in various ways, I was eventually diagnosed with Lyme disease, multiple chemical sensitivity, and toxic mold poisoning. And for my case, in my body, it was kind of like a domino effect. And I think that's another thing that's common in the chronic illness world is one thing will lead to another as your body just weakens or you face different things. So mold was my first domino, and then it went from there.
So you can have other things present itself in the body because of the body struggling with one illness, which makes sense because if the body is beginning to weaken, it would make sense that these other illnesses could penetrate your health barrier. You realize something's wrong. And so you get this diagnosis. What was your first reaction when you get the confirmed diagnosis and you begin to realize this equates to limitations? And I think you even go on to say that you were bedridden and housebound. That's limitations. That's strong. So what were you thinking when you're like, hold on a minute, I've had a very active lifestyle and this diagnosis is going to lead to these problems? I feel sure your mind immediately went to God, just because that's what I do to make sense of it. But were you mad or confused? What did it look like for you? Did you connect with God or maybe disconnect from God?
So I was undiagnosed for a long time, and then when it came to mind one day, and I feel like it was just a God thing of like, could it be mold? Like we didn't know that mold was something that could have such a significant effect on someone. You know, it's like dust, it's everywhere, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's not generally on people's radars, but we like researched on our own, and then happened to be seeing my doctor, a naturopath at that time. And so was like, could it be this? And so he did a blood test, and I went to that doctor appointment and then never went home after that. I left the house that morning thinking it was just another regular appointment. But on the way home, my mom dropped me off at a friend's house, and my family then started to pack up our home. And in the process, we weren't able to keep many of the things because the
Mm,
mold was growing in the walls, and the mycotoxins permeated everything that was permeable. So basically anything that wasn't glass or metal, the
wow.
journals, the Bibles, the scrapbooks, the baby blankets, all of those things couldn't be used by anyone after that. And so I went to my friend's house and waited for the results of this blood test. But then when they came in, it was a party, honestly, because finally we had answers.
Right.
Finally, it
Okay.
was like, oh, here's something we can do. Like, I have, I can get out of this situation. I can detox my body. I can heal from this. And so I didn't realize what would happen when the diagnosis came. I didn't know the effect that it was going to have. And so the effects that initially it had was my family needing to move unexpectedly, very suddenly. We were living in rainy Washington state, and so we moved to stay with some friends, and it moved a couple of times before we finally settled in Arizona. But in the process, like had to, we lost our community, we lost our home, we lost some sentimental possessions and things like
Yeah.
that. And in that period, I lost not only my community, but like my ability to even make new friends, to invest in new community. And so a lot of the questions I had at that point was just like, why is this happening? But especially, why is this happening and affecting my family? Like, it's one thing for it to affect me. I'm like, okay, like I had this, I'm going to be tough. I'm going to, endure it. I'm going to be suffering well. And God grew me in that. And I think that the ability to ask him questions in that was the what made my faith stay strong and grow in the suffering. If I had limited myself from asking questions to God, it would have just created these walls between him and I. And that's true in any relationship. Um, with a family member, with a friend, if there's things that you're not willing to go there, not willing to talk about that, well, then there's walls and there's parts of you that are separated from that person. But we're so quick to do that with God, thinking that we're being faithful. Well, oh, if we just don't entertain those questions, if we don't entertain those doubts, then, we're being a good Christian. But when we ask God those questions and direct them to him, he's able to enter in with us. So my faith definitely struggled with that in there, and asking those questions was good for me. But in that process was asking like, why is this happening to my family? Why did my family lose their community? Why did my family lose their home? Is this my fault? Have I done something wrong? I don't know, just all of those things. So losing community, struggling with family relationships, all culminated to this point of moving to a new state, Arizona, being bedridden, housebound, and not able to go to church, not able to go to the library, community gathering places where you might meet people, unlike the previous moves that I had done in my life up until that point.
That's life changing, life altering for a young person. Well, for anyone really, but when you're in the peak of activity, physical coming and going, and life is busy and whatnot, and then it's just shut down. But that's kind of how I see God working when He interrupts our life. It's an abrupt stop. And then we're faced with some really hard questions, deep pain, deeper questions about, God, what are you doing? Where are you? Do you even care? When you got real with the Lord and were asking your painful questions, did you feel that He was receptive to that? Did you feel that He rejected you? Do you feel that He got quiet? What was the way that you could perceive that He received you?
It definitely looked different in different seasons of chronic illness. The thing about chronic illness is like it's long. It's really long. So there's a lot of ups and downs. There were points where a lot of times where I didn't get the answers I wanted to. And when it got to like the worst points, the darkest points where my health was the worst, there was a point where I was given a month to live and where like, relationships around me, dreams around me were all falling apart. Or I did kind of like give I'm like, God, I believe in you, but I give up trying. Like I just can't. And there are two instances in particular that I kind of came to that point of like I just don't know where to go. Like I don't know. I don't have the answers I need. I looked for the answers through people as well around me and tried to find resources, which I'm excited to talk about resources
Yes.
later because it took me a while to find them and that definitely contributed to like I'm crazy and I am a bad Christian and those weren't true. Yeah, God didn't answer my direct questions, but he did tell me the truth through his word, through just like his Holy Spirit, through the people around me of like who I was and who he was. I think that's probably what kept me kept me going.
When you think about this process of getting real with the Lord, there's always this challenging aspect because He's introducing His truth into what we believe. And what I found out about myself when I was going through my dark season of grief over losing my husband, I he challenged my lie-based thinking. I wouldn't have thought of it as lie-based
Mm.
thinking, except that it did not line up when God presented the truth to me. And then I had to evaluate it with him, and I was like, "Wow, okay, I I did not perceive you in that way. I thought you were different in that way." Can you think of any sort of, and I'm gonna term it for me, you can term it your way, any lie-based thinking that you had put him in a box per se, and then he comes along and kind of disrupts that with his truth, which sets you free, but nonetheless, it's like, wow, you got to wrap your mind around that too.
Like I said before, my prior to this, I had a pretty bubble wrapped life. And so it was really easy to say the right things and go along with what adult Christians around me told me about God. But then when I actually had to face it, it was like, oh, well, what, like, how do I reconcile God's love and wanting good for me with the suffering that he is allowing in my life, with the pain that is going on? Is he really here? It seems like everyone else left. Like, is he really present in what I'm going through? And if he is, where is he and why isn't he acting? And so in that, like the lies that I struggled with were lies about myself, like I'm not good enough or this is my fault. And then also like lies about God, like he isn't here or I think ultimately it boiled down to wrestling with, do I believe that he is as powerful as the Bible says he is? And do I believe that he is love? Because if those two things are true, then I could trust that. I could trust him. If only one of those things was true, then that brings up a lot more questions. But if I could trust that he is able to do what he says he's able to do, and that he loves me, then this has to be some kind of, I don't know. I have to trust that he sees the bigger picture. I think that was something that really influenced me, was getting to learn more about eternity. I think going through, I don't know, my body deteriorating, my life falling apart really got me thinking about heaven and longing for eternity with him, longing for Revelation 21 where it says there will be no more crying, no more pain, no more mourning. And in the context of thinking about eternity, that makes, like Paul says, like the present suffering isn't worth being compared. And I saw his love in the ways that he met me, in the ways that he didn't allow me to keep living a bubble wrap life, but he brought me closer to him. He opened my eyes to see more of my own skills and talents, and enjoyed the fulfillment of like living in those. He took away layers of like unhealthy functioning in my family that probably we would have continued in if it hadn't been revealed through going through hard things together. So yeah, the lie of my worth, and then also the lie of like who he is, but the truth that I needed to wrestle with, and that did take time to wrestle with, was who is he and who am I, and can I trust that that is true?
And that's a deep journey with the Lord when you look at that,
Mhm.
when you're questioning who he is. Because when we do find out who he is, or we begin to discover, we begin to receive revelation, his truth and his word, and through examples, it's kind of scary because it starts to pull apart the things we had built our life on and around. And we have to have the courage to step out into what he's offering us, offering to reveal to us about who he is, his character, and his nature. A minute ago, you said he took away your bubble wrap so that, you couldn't live this little cushy life. I say cushy, and I don't mean materialistic wise, but maybe idealistic life of who God was, apart from suffering. There's a book called Severe Mercy, and I can't remember now who it's by.
Mhm.
It was one of C.S. Lewis's friends that wrote it, and it's a story about his wife dying, and he equated God doing this to him because it caused him to come to the Lord through it. So when you talk about God taking away your bubble wrap and it being difficult and painful, do you believe that's a severe mercy that God would have towards you with revealing who he is?
We were talking about like before I got sick and when I got sick, but if I'm looking at my life now, I see even in this week, like the chance to enter into to someone else's pain that I wouldn't have had the skills or the knowledge or the comfort zone to do before, or the chance to also like share God's love with them, not in a pat way, but in a way that is has struggled with it and has wrestled with it. I think it also just, suffering takes away our distractions. Whatever the suffering is, like especially American culture, we love our distractions. We love productivity. We love entertainment. Suffering, and in my case, like chronic illness, just pushes up against that. It takes away our ability to rely on ourselves in those areas, or to be distracted, and it forces us to look at the deeper things. It forces us to look at our hearts, and also to wonder about God's heart, um, to make sense of what we're going through.
Earlier, when you and I had a conversation, you said something I thought was very profound, and I would like to hear more about it. And I think this is the great segue. I feel like this is the type of beauty that God reveals when we're in the trenches with Him. And you and I were talking about what is a fulfilling, purposeful life. And you said the purpose isn't in the accomplishment, it's in the faithfulness and the obedience. Talk to us a little bit more about that. What faithfulness? What obedience?
It comes back to the Bible. Like what does God actually ask you to do? What does God actually say? And the Bible says a lot about doing good things, about like living well, but it talks about most about our relationship with him. It talks about just obeying him. Something that I have been wrestling with in the context of like accomplishment and productivity, because I had all these plans. I was going to use my high school years, my young adult years to, help with youth ministries and church ministries and serve on overseas trips. And I just had all these ideas. And then I spent those years in doctor's offices and in bed. I did not accomplish things. And even just looking at like my siblings or my friends, my brother's a highly successful person, just like in his businesses that he's run and athletically and things like that. And so like even just comparing myself to that, it's so easy to compare myself to what God had for him, but what God had for me was different, and what obedience was for me was different. We're both, for example, my brother and I are both called to, obey the Ten Commandments and love people and all of the things that are outlined in the Bible. But what it has looked like for him and what it has looked like for me are different. And that doesn't mean that one of us is doing it is less than. And it was so easy. And that was a big struggle and lie that I struggled with, was feeling like I was less than because I wasn't accomplishing things and I wasn't being productive. But I would argue with myself that I was, those days of lying in bed, staring at the ceiling were not unproductive. Those days were days of wrestling with questions. Those were days of praying for people. Those were days of suffering well. And I think suffering well is faithfulness. Laying there, continuing to trust God is faithfulness, is obedience. A question that I have been asking myself lately, like coming to the end of my a day where I didn't accomplish all the things I wanted to do, I didn't check off things off my list. A question that I have been asking myself, I feel like God has been asking me, is like, was I obedient? Can I come to the end of the day and did I obey God? And if I have, can I be content with that? Or do I need to do all of these other things that will impress others or even just help others, but that are my expectations of myself? The question I've been asking is, what are God's expectations of me? And can I be content resting in that instead of getting distracted with other people's expectations of me or my expectations of me?
I think about the simplicity of what you're saying really is the core of the life that God calls us to. We add so much more to it. I'm not saying that people, their giftings and their talents and stuff like that, that if they use them, they're not listening to God. I'm not saying that, but there is a simplicity about following God that we make a lot more difficult. For instance, if I take the time in a day to say, Lord, here's my to-do list. What parts of this to-do list do you want me to do today? And he might pick out one or two for me. And I'm like, Lord, I got 5, I got 7 things to do. But do you know that when I am obedient to him, there's so much reward in the tasks that he highlighted for me versus me cramming it all into one day and trying to get it all done. And so what you're saying resonates with me in the sense that there is so much value to taking God's lead for the simplicity, because he says that, his yoke is light. And I believe that it means even in the day-to-day demands and the demands we put on ourselves, the demands that are required of our responsibilities and the roles that we fulfill. And it sounds like, too, this slower pace strips away your pride. It strips away having to perform for other people. Not that we have to, but I think we do. I think we put pressure on ourselves to show up in a certain way. So I can see that there's a lot of freedom in those areas as well. To a point you made just before that, you were talking about suffering well, but I think people are uncomfortable with suffering. Do you find that in your health condition, do you find that people pull away because, for many reasons, but what I can think of is that they can't change your circumstance. They feel like they can't help you. And so they pull away because they don't know what to do. They're overwhelmed. They don't have the capacity to be in your life based on your health condition.
Yeah, I wrote a blog post recently that was talking about when the casseroles stop coming, because we can like do pretty well, I think, in just gathering together when something happens, like an emergency happens. You make the casseroles and you show up and you do the thing. But then when a chronic illness, for example, like is chronic, it continues. It's out of sight and out of mind is just so often a reality. Other people's lives go on, but when your lifestyle changes and you're not able to participate in the like social gatherings that are usually where you would connect with people, it just there's a lot of those who have chronic illness that I have connected with are just isolated, even just circumstantially. But even when there are people that are aware, that are wanting to enter in, I think so often you just don't know how. How do you enter in? What do you do with this? What do you do when there aren't answers? When you're asking God questions, when you're praying for healing and he does and I would say you stay. You stick around. You keep just being in, entering in. I think in my own experience, some of the most comforting truth that God reminded me was that he is with us. Jesus is called Emmanuel, like God with us. Deuteronomy talks about like, do not be afraid or discouraged because he's with us. He goes with us wherever we will go. He's with us. And I think God, like that's what we as people get to do for each other as well in suffering is just enter in and be there, not necessarily say anything because sometimes sometimes that can be worse. That doesn't always help. I've part
Yeah.
of the isolation of chronic illness that and I know a lot of other people have heard is, well, it's because of your sin that you're sick, or you don't have enough faith that or if you did, you know, my aunt's cousin's friend's solution with coconut oil and frogs, you'd be great, I just made up frogs, but
I was gonna say that
it's
that
like
was funny.
there's there's lots of things that you want to say, but when you've entered in and you've been with, that's when you learn maybe what to say. When you've come to an understanding. But understanding requires presence and it requires long presence. It requires enduring presence. And that's hard when even like everyone's trying to accomplish things. Everyone's outgoing and accomplishing and doing and you're not. And so their life takes them away and even if they want to help, they don't always know how.
And we give people grace for that because
Absolutely.
when I entered in on the side of the griever, I was in a whole different place. And I was like, I'll never say that again. I'll never say that again. I'm not doing that. And one of the powerful things that I realized too is you don't have to say anything. Like you were making the point. Sometimes it's better not to say anything. Just show up, just sit, just let them pour out whatever they want to pour out. If they want to talk, let them talk. If they want to cry, don't be uncomfortable with tears. You don't have to solve their problem. You just have to let them know you're
Mhm.
not alone. And presence is everything because that's what the Lord did for me. It was his presence. He wasn't going to change my situation. My husband was gone, so he's not going to bring him. But the presence of Jesus made all the difference in the world. There's just something about suffering. There's a portion of it that you must do alone. And nobody, if a
Mhm.
person cannot change your circumstance, they really can't help you. But God comes in and gives you the beauty of his presence. That's transformational for me. It was for me. Speaking of loneliness is the perfect opportunity to walk right into one of Satan's most fertile strategies of spiritual attack, and that's isolation. When somebody's inability to stay engaged in the normal day to day rhythm that they once knew, in what ways does isolation become dangerous territory? Can you think of any ways where you were being challenged or, spiritual attacks, second guessing God's nature and his character?
Like you were saying, the there's some parts of suffering you have to do alone. Like it's not all bad. Loneliness is not necessarily the enemy. Solitude can be really sacred space, but also like God designed us to be in community. We see that in how he has put families together. We see how that and how Adam lived in perfection without sin with God, and still God said, he still needs someone. Like he still needed a person. And so God created Eve. And it wasn't like there was nothing wrong at that point, but he still needed someone. And we've talked about how chronic illness, just like lifestyle and circumstances and things like that, leave you isolated or lonely. I think that my darkest times were there's a couple of nights that come to mind. I mentioned the two times where I like was specifically like I give up, like God, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. How do I endure? And in those both happened at like late at night. And what in the chronic illness world we call pain somnia, where it's just like pain that keeps you up at night. And so it's just like in that quiet where everyone had gone to sleep, everyone went like there wasn't I didn't want to bother anyone. So I felt like there was no one to talk to, even of the few relationships that I had at that point. And yeah, in that there was just like there was no one to speak truth. There was no one to say, hang on, you're saying that and that doesn't sound right. That's not reality. Or even to be like, oh, is that really what you believe? Like, is that really what you, because it's so easy to just get stuck. And like there was real pain, real physical pain, real mental pain. I struggled with a lot of like depression, anxiety, and like just brain fog and like unclear thinking. And so like I was lost and I felt like I didn't know what to do. And I one of the things that really helped me in that was friendship and was the people that were entering into that. So like in that isolation, I would just spiral. I there was no check. There was nothing to like stop me outside of God, and he did and he entered into that. But something that my friends and I started doing is I would be like, okay, and I would say something like, I'm a burden, real or not real, or whatever the thing was that I was struggling with. And I stole this from the Hunger Games movies. In all honesty, so spiritual. But then they could tell me like, no, like this is real or this is not real. And it was people that I trusted, even when I wasn't sure I trusted my own thinking. There were people who I knew loved God and who I knew were basing everything they said on his word. And that is what like kept was the lifeline in that season of life.
Mm.
But when they weren't there were these dark nights, that was the when it would spiral the worst because there was no one to say otherwise.
No one to check that racing mind. I know how that feels.
Right.
I really appreciate you making that distinction between solitude and isolation because it was kind of like when people say, I'm lonely, but I'm not alone, ever so slightly, but yet very powerful to make that distinction because with Christ, we're never alone. We can feel lonely, but we're never alone. You referenced Psalm 46, and I'll let people go read that on their own. But what an what an incredibly beautiful reminder of God's power, authority, courage, and deep love for us. Something you mentioned was, I wonder if knowing that He is God is dependent on knowing that we are not. And so you looked at the original Hebrew and translated to weak and frail. In our weakness, we discover who he is. And true to God's value system, he sees weak as beautiful. What has been your experience in exploring your weakness and God's strength? Can you think of an example of God showing his strength in your weakness?
Even just in relationships, like I mentioned earlier, I feel like in my weakness, he's given me like just more capacity for compassion and things like that. But I remember like there are various days where I just was like, I just can't keep going. Like I'm in so much pain. I don't know how I'm going to, make it through this family dinner or make it, go get dressed or go shower or things like that. And just would pray for like, God, you know what I need to do today. And like asking for help being content with what he wanted me to do rather than what I wanted me to do, but also asking for like I can't do this on my own. Will you give me just like supernatural energy and strength? One of the things that as I was bedridden, as I was, not able to go out and do all these things that I wanted to be doing, I started writing because I always enjoyed writing. And so I started like a blog and it led into other things, but as I started writing about my experiences, I would get afraid every time I was going to publish something, like a blog post or an article or something like that. I'd be like, God, like I know I have a lot of brain fog. I know that I can't like think very well. I can't communicate very well. Like there were periods where I struggled to even like speak like sentences because of the brain damage that happened from the mold poisoning. But would you still use it? Like would you use it? And the blog posts that were the most chaotic and the most confusing, in my opinion, were the ones that got the most comments or people being like, oh, like this is my experience too. This is what I'm going through too. Or I've had people be like, oh, like, thank you for sharing, like, thank you for telling us that this is coming from this place or that you have this thing going on because it means that I can also like have that. Like it's okay for me to share about that kind of thing. And so I saw God like use my weakness to serve people, to show people that they weren't alone. Not only to like you can tell people, oh, like I'm here, I'm with you, or I'm not alone, you're not alone, but when God, our weakness shows people God in our lives, but it also shows them that they're not alone in what they're going through. So yeah, I just saw God in like the content I produced that was the least quality, or the things I struggled to do were like that's where he worked. That's where a breakthrough happened, or that's where a conversation happened that wouldn't have otherwise.
When you're vulnerable, it does open conversation for people to step into that space and be vulnerable as well. As you were talking about, I was reminded of a quote by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and she was a Swiss American psychiatrist and a pioneer in near-death studies. And one of the quotes that really stuck out for me, which I was like, it's so true, because of the podcast that I have this opportunity to talk to people who have gone through some really hard things. And in your case, like living with loss and uncertainty over an extended period of time. And so I'm intrigued by the human spirit, the desire to live, to thrive. And the quote was, the most beautiful people we have known are those who have known defeat, known suffering, known struggle, known loss, and have found their way out of the depths. These persons have an appreciation, a sensitivity, and an understanding of life that fills them with compassion, gentleness, and a deep, loving concern. Beautiful people do not just happen. And I see that in you, and I see that in so many of my other guests, that the place that God takes us to, there is a beauty in exchange for deep pain. And I think one of the more beautiful things for me is that God reveals who he is. I say very often that God speaks beautiful things in the dark. So when you think about where God has taken you in this deep valley and at times pitch dark valley, can you think of something that surprised you about God? Like you knew God, but more from a bubble wrap nature or perspective, and then he takes you into this very dark valley, and then you find out some intimate things about him and you grow in intimacy with him. What surprised you about his nature and his character?
I think something that really hit me, I was just like seeing God's love, but seeing his love in ways I didn't expect. Seeing his love through Jesus weeping with Mary and Martha over the death of Lazarus, even though he knew what was coming, like even though he knew what was going to happen. There's a song, Weep With Me by Rend Collective, that really like was kind of like an anthem for a while of just like God entering into in like God hurting with me, I guess. And I don't know have all the right like theological words for this, but like getting to see in his word, his anger over injustice, his anger over sin and the effects of sin. Getting to see not only see but like see in my life, see in his word, but see in my life his value for those things. See like he hurting with me, him keeping track of my tears like it says in Psalms, and just those are things that are not super comfortable to think about. At least they weren't before, of like, oh, God is love, he is good, he good things, but love also looks like anger, and love also looks like sadness, and love also looks like grief, and just getting to experience his love in those things, not just in my anger and my grief, but also in his anger over injustice, or his grief over things not being the way that he designed. Just seeing Jesus' empathy, Jesus weeping, Jesus understanding and compassion, and like not from a distance, but like in it with me.
And you may have just hit on the core of why we struggle with the Lord when bad things happen, because that's not how I don't know whether it's that we're sold a different Jesus. When we say God is love, we perceive love in a different manner. We don't see it as including suffering and pain. We don't see it as anger. Like some people won't even give themselves permission to be angry about something. They don't know the distinction between righteous anger and then anger, a malice. And so I think that's maybe the fine line that we walk with the Lord when we're trying to figure out his character and his nature and line it up with what we're experiencing
Mhm.
firsthand. Something you said just a second ago about the tears. What do you think God's going to do with those tears? He catches them, he puts them in a bottle. What do you think he's going to do with those tears?
I don't know. That's a very interesting question. Something that has captured my imagination lately, this is just my imagination, but like is in Revelation where it talks about like the prayers of the saints or like the incense. I'm just wondering how many of those prayers are like desperate and tearful, not just like, the devout prayers that we're imagining or that I imagine, but like, I don't know. What are they?
I don't know. Interesting. I think that's where a lot of the intimacy that grows with God when we begin to explore his word, his nature, his character, his love, and then we learn more and more about him because I have found that he is very willing to reveal himself, very willing to help us find our way through our questions and whatnot. I wondered about the tears in the sense that, Lord, are you going to just wash the residue of this life off of us as we step into
Hmm,
glory? I don't know. Just my way of entertaining,
it's
exploring God.
beautiful to me.
I wonder if this is something that everyone at some point in time in their life, they have to face this question with God. Because I did when I was, talking to him about my husband. And he said, Sherry, if you don't get what you want, knowing I'm not going to get what I want, but he said, if you don't get what you want, and I don't hear audible words, they're spoken, downloaded into my spirit. And if I don't do it the way you want me to do it, will you still love me? Am I still enough for you? Were you posed with that question in your spirit as well? Something to that degree?
Yeah, I think in a way, the way that I wrestled with it was just God kind of asked me, like, do I want healing more than I want the healer? Like, do I want my body to be fixed more than I want him? Do I want answers to my questions and decisions more than I want relationship with him and closeness with him? Because like I just desperate for things to end. I would pray constantly for healing, but like did I want him as much as I wanted that? That's kind of the question that it's been for me.
Were you challenged by that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the answer depended on the day, depends on the day. Like, wait, honestly, where am I at? I don't know. Sometimes I'm really focused on that healing more than the healer. Sometimes, sometimes I can surrender that and let it go better than others, but it definitely fluctuates.
Fair enough. Fair enough. What sort of advice or suggestions maybe do you have for people whose attitude is to simply stick it out, just endure? Is there anything they need to look closer at with regard to God's heart or his nature, his character?
I think of Paul asking like God to take in Second Corinthians asking God to take the thorn away and just like God's answer, which we already touched on this earlier, but God's answer was like, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is perfect in weakness. It wasn't suck it up, deal with it. It was rely on me. Like let me help you. Let me let it be my power and not yours. I think like endurance, there's only so much we can do as humans because we are finite. When it's dependent on us, on our faith or our love or our physical ability or strength or mental fortitude or whatever it is. Yeah, because he's compassionate. Like it is grace, it is love, it is those things that are what keep us going. It wasn't my strength. And I'd like to say I'm pretty tough. Like I think I'm pretty tough, honestly. Especially on the other side of these things that I went through, but that's not what like keeps me going. And what probably made me tough was learning less to rely less on me and more on him. But at the same time, like no matter how tough I am, eventually you're going to break. Eventually it's beyond you and you can't keep going and you can't keep holding on. I was reading Romans 5 this morning where it's like suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, and character produces hope. But like the hope is not in us. The hope is Jesus, who is, First Peter talks about him being our living hope. Like he himself is our hope. It's not us.
With regard to the slower pace of life, I got a little excited about hearing all the different things that not only have you started looking into and experiencing and pursuing, but you made the point that because of a slower pace, there is a ministry that can be done, enjoyed, from people who are bedridden, who are homebound. Like you talked about a snail mail ministry. That is not even popular right now, but it still means something to people. You talked about listening well to people, praying with people, not just praying for somebody in a distance, but having the time to go in and pray for somebody. That's life changing. Even those three things right there that you mentioned, you're pursuing a lot of things that has developed into ministry for you. So, what are some of the benefits of a slower paced life?
I think that the church needs the world and the church need the chronically ill. I mean, those who are suffering generally, you have a different world, different perspective. As we've talked about already, suffering is like it's hard, it's not comfortable for a lot of people or the thought of it. But in that we discover things about God that the church needs to know, that people need to hear about. Like it's one thing for even just in sharing the gospel with an unbeliever, like it's one thing to say, oh, like God is, God is all of these things. And it's another thing to be like, I know that because I've lived it. I think it's Revelation somewhere that says, like, we'll overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. And those who have gone through suffering have a unique testimony of God's love, a testimony that is reliable, that's dependable, that's really hard to argue with because it's not something that's like just intellectual. It's something that's deep and that's heart rooted, heart related. And so because of that, like it's just really needed our testimonies, but also like there are a lot of actions that we can do even as we are in the stillness, and because of the stillness or the slowing down of life or the non-traditional route that you might take. I think it just requires a lot of creativity. I think that one of the best things, if you have a chronic illness, if you know someone who is chronically ill, that you can do is lean into creativity, whether that's in engaging relationally. Maybe you're not going out for coffee. Maybe you're coming over for a movie. Or maybe you can't meet in person. Maybe you can video call, even if you live in the same town. But then when it comes to like opportunities to serve those around you, your gifts are still needed, even if it looks different than what fits into the norm around you, whether that's the normal life rhythms or like the normal church model, as particularly in the US and the West. And so there have been people like for me, it's gotten to be my writing. I couldn't go help lead youth groups, but I could start writing what God was showing me and teaching me from my bed. I, through that, was able to share with people around the world, not just in my little hometown, but like getting to tell my testimony and what God had done in my life to people from a variety of countries. And then I got to start doing like teaching some online, like webinars, and we started an online conference for those who are chronically ill because I couldn't travel, like I couldn't I couldn't go 2 hours away from my home, but even especially with the technology available to me, I could reach other people. But like you're saying, a friend of mine started like a snail mail ministry. And so she maybe can't go speak encouragement to people because she's not in the same social spaces, but she's able to send something. I got something in the mail this morning from a friend of mine, and it's just like, oh, it's so powerful because even though we can't necessarily come together in person or reach each other in the same way, she's still able to share her gift of encouragement in a different way. Or potentially like as someone else I know, they like to like create things, knit and crochet. And so they are able to give to people who need blankets, need hats, need things like that. Or someone else that I know who also has a chronic illness creates care packages and mails those to people. There's just so many different options and so many ways to serve by meeting people's tangible needs, by praying for people, because you have, long period of time, you might have space where you can't do anything else but or even if you struggle to communicate, God still understands what you're saying. I love, and I think it's Romans 8 where it talks about like the groanings. The groanings are
Mhm.
prayer too. And like even if you can't pray necessarily eloquently or communicate well with people, like you could still do that. So yeah, the church and the world need the chronically ill. It just takes a bit more creativity. But I feel very passionately about this. Like, please lean into that. Do what that might look like for you and your gifts and your ability. Not to accomplish things, not to just do more, but as a way to express the love and the truth that God is revealing to you in your suffering, or even the lament and the confusion, because those questions, again, a lot of people avoid, but you voicing those questions not only strengthens your faith, but can strengthen the faith of those around you.
Yes, if you're verbalizing the hard questions and the things that people are thinking but won't say it because they feel like it's ungodly and sacrilege because they're questioning God's sovereignty or authority or whatever, it does open the dialogue for people to get honest. And God's willing to work in honesty. He already knows what the problem is, but he's not going to snatch it from us and he's not going to demand that we tell him. But when we do, he can work in that space. We've opened the door to invite him in to have this conversation with us, or at least to give him space to speak his truth into these painful questions. One of the things that I love about what you're doing as far as exploring your quiet time, your slower pace, is the fact that you're writing a book at the moment, and I want to talk about that here in a minute when we get to resources. So you're an author and you're a blogger. You have a website, but you also have created an online conference for people, and so I want to get to those as a resource. But before we go there, I wanted to ask you. We've talked about a lot of things that you've had to lay down, your goals, your dreams, your desires. But what has God given you? Maybe it's all of them, but we have a few minutes left here. So maybe a couple of the things that you had dreamed of, your family, marriage, missions, although you did just mention he's taken you all around the world with your blog. But how has God surprised you by giving some things back, double blessings? What does that look like for you?
I remember when I was 15, I remember sitting on the floor, I don't know, maybe in my parents' bedroom. No one was around. And I remember just sitting there crying because I was realizing for the first time I wasn't sure about, like, I had dreamed and desired, oh, like, yes, someday I want to get married, I want to have kids. But in that moment I was like, well, how can I do that? Like, how can I take care of someone else when I can't take care of myself? And how how would this affect a future family, and some other, like, just really wrestling with, like, could what I have be passed on as well to children, and like what do I do with that? I was 15. My friends were like, who am I going to go to homecoming with? And I'm like, I can't have a family. And I was really really sad about that and, like, grieving that. And so in that was a time of surrender, like, again, wrestling with God's love all over again. Like, do you, these are really good, beautiful things that I want to do. These are things that are, like, these are biblical things. And I feel like they're taken away from me. And I, like, fully accepted that those things would not happen. In addition to wanting to have a family, I also wanted to write and publish. And I didn't know how I was going to do that when I couldn't think in full sentences. And then I also wanted to serve overseas, and I didn't know how, like, how are you going to do that when you can't make it to the bathroom or the other side of the house, like. And so there was a long period of, like, fully letting go of those dreams. We're just like, oh, these are not an option for me, these aren't going to happen. But in my life, God has resurrected those ones in particular, or some of them. I do not have any children, but I I got to explore in that period of letting go of those other dreams. I explored this writing. I got to do these other things. And then even that, like, opened doors for me to connect with other groups and other organizations. I really, really wanted to serve cross-culturally, and I couldn't leave my house, right? So I, like, just sent emails to all these different organizations and was like, hey, I really want to do this. I can write. Is there anything I can write for you? And so I started writing devotionals for, like, a Middle East group and things like that. And that was just, like, so much fun to get to do that. But along the way, my body started to recover to the point where I was able to be a lot more functional. My mind started to recover. And along the way, I made connections. I built relationships that led into writing. I ended up publishing a book about faith in God and chronic illness, which is not what my 12-year-old, 13-year-old, 15-year-old self imagined. I did not think that I was going to be, I don't know, I didn't even know what chronic illness meant as a term. And so getting to like the what I went through influenced then what those dreams ended up looking like and how they were resurrected. I got to serve overseas last year, and it was really, really sweet and really special. But because of what I had gone through, I got to connect with, like, there's a woman there in particular I'm thinking of who also, struggles with chronic illness and some long-term health challenges. And because of that, we got to connect on a deeper level, and I got to build relationship with her. Because of that, I was able to share. It was so easy to share what God had done because it was so big, because the suffering was so big. It was so like I could share what God had done, and that was like really impactful to other people that I got to engage with while I was there. And then I just got married just about a year ago to someone who also like just I actually met in an online class because again, I didn't go to college. I couldn't go do that, but I met him through a like leadership class I was taking, and we got to know each other that way. And now he like is able to partner with me as a caregiver, but also in just being able to do that for other people. And I even saw God prepare him to enter into this with me through his roommate who had some chronic illness things. So he had lived with someone who had similar physical health limitations, and then also through just some other impactful people in his life. So God resurrected these dreams in ways that I didn't expect, but also for them to happen the way that they did, they needed to die in the way that they did.
Yes, because once again, we have our ways of thinking about how it should look, what it
Right.
should look like, how it presents itself. But then God comes along and rewrites all of that. So I'm going to get ready to wrap up. We're going to talk about resources, and also too, we can skim over them, but all the links will be in the show notes. So if anybody's looking for further information, all those links will be in there. As we've been talking about all the things that you've laid down and the dreams that you put on the altar for the Lord, that the fact that you want to be a missionary, you want to be a mom, you want to be a wife, and then God resurrects portions of that. So to me, you wanted to serve God with your whole life, your whole heart. And you've shared with us the full spectrum of your emotions and the journey forward after the diagnosis of chronic illness. So my question now is, has it settled into your mind or your heart that you are indeed serving God with your whole life and your whole heart? It just doesn't look like what you initially thought it would look like.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a gradual process over time. I think it's hard to pinpoint a time because it kind of happened like I just started writing a blog because I wanted to do something and it sounded fun. But then somewhere along the way that turned from a hobby into a job, into a pursuit, into a career. The first conference that we did for those who are chronically ill, we didn't plan on doing more than one, but afterwards people were like still wanting to connect. I think that's probably where I got to see where for me it became like, oh, this is a reality, was just seeing God use it in other people's lives and just hearing other people's testimonies and other people's stories of what they were going through helped me to see that what I was going through and getting to share that with people was worthwhile and was needed.
Do you find it as rewarding as you had hoped serving God with your whole life and your whole heart would be?
I It's both, yeah, yes and no. Like, yes, this is really fulfilling and I can't imagine not doing this. At the same time as it's not as romanticized as it was as a young teenager. And I think that has been true no matter what ministry has looked like, including serving overseas or serving with like a youth outreach program, Young Life, more locally in the US, of just like, oh, like the romanticism wears off. It's hard. Obedience is hard no matter what that looks like in your life. But at the same time, there's peace in it, and there's joy in that. There's joy in doing what God created you to do. Even if it takes time figuring out what God created you to do, or even if what that looks like changes. What you were doing before was also fulfilling, but now it's different.
Yeah. Yeah. You're right. The new car smell wears off after a while, but your passion remains, and that's a beautiful thing. Let's get to the resources really quick, and then I'm going to wrap up with two questions because I have gone way over, and I apologize for that because I told you an hour, but what a fantastic conversation, and I'm really enjoying it. So let's
Me
talk
too.
about, yeah, good. I'm so glad because that's, you're blessing my heart so much. Let's talk about resources because you mentioned, I know you have a book coming out or it just came out. Then you said you wrote a book earlier. So you're an author and you're a blogger and you have a website where you minister from. And then you have the online conference. Also, you mentioned a pastor, David Heflin. You mentioned Chronic Joy Ministries, Broken and Mended Ministries. So give us a little bit of a quick overview of these beautiful resources for chronically ill people.
Yes. So I've shared I felt alone. A lot of people feel alone. If you are chronically ill and you are listening to this, you are not alone. You are not alone. And there are a lot of people who are wrestling with the same questions, who are going through similar circumstances. And there are also a lot of resources. So some of the ones that I would really recommend are Chronic Joy. They have a lot of resources for chronic illness, disability, mental health struggles. Yeah, they have a lot of resources there to consume or to share or to read, things like that. Broken and Mended Ministries, which Pastor David Heflin founded, they do a lot of like small groups, and they also will help you set up small groups if there's not one that's near you or if there's not one that works to remotely for you. And so that's super helpful for like getting to connect with other people that get it. Esther Smith has a lot of great books on chronic illness and faith in God in that. And she's a licensed counselor, and she creates also like other resources and small groups and things like that. So those are some great places to start. There are a ton more, but I'll leave that at that for now. But what I would also love to invite you to is the Diamonds Conference. So my I did publish a book. It's called He's Making Diamonds, and that's general about faith in God and chronic illness. We talk about asking God questions, talk about praying. Do you still pray for healing when, stuff isn't leaving? How do you rest when you can't rest, when there's no vacation from chronic illness? How do you keep hoping when it's a cycle of disappointed hopes or diagnoses or things that just don't go the way that you're expecting them to? So that's what that book is about. We'll definitely share the link with you. But when I published that book, I was like, well, now what do I do? And we started a conference it's an online conference for Christians with chronic illnesses. And so we have done it, I don't know, last 6 years or so, twice a year. And we gather a lot of people. And so if you need more resources, this is the place to come because we generally have between like 20 and 25 speakers, and we have that all have a chronic illness. They're authors, they're pastors, they're bloggers, they're speakers, and they share their testimonies, and they share what they have learned. They share about relationships, they share about trusting God, they share about a wide range of things from a wide range of chronic illnesses. The next one is actually happening this month. It's going to be January 24th through 26th in 2025. So we'll share the link with that. But this year it's about courage facing financial strain, courage facing a misdiagnosis and undiagnosis, courage trying to navigate relationships or marriage when you're chronically ill and things like that. So we would love for you to join us for that, and we'll definitely send you the link. But we do events regularly, and it's just a chance to like join in from your hospital bed, join in from your home, join in wherever you're at, and connect with other people who get it, who actually understand what you're going through, and who are in the trenches still with you.
That's a comfort to a lot of people who don't want to have to explain their issue or they don't want to talk a certain way and nobody even understand or get what they're trying to say. You just show up and you just have normal conversations with people in like-minded groups and they get you. They get you. And that's a beautiful thing. And it sounds like this is such a well-rounded conference too. Breakout sessions, interviews, teaching sessions,
Mm-hmm.
panels. Beautiful. All right. I have taxed your time. So my wrap-up question for today is, if our listeners only remember one thing about this conversation, what is the one thing you want them to remember?
You are not alone in what you are going through. Not only are there other people that understand or that are wrestling with the same things you are, but God is with you. He's present. He sees you. He sees the things that are not seen. You are not out of sight, out of mind to him. You have great purpose still, and his grace is sufficient for you.
And it's exploring those hard places and those hard questions with the Lord that will reveal the beauty and the depth
Hmm.
and the meaning of that kind of scripture. Knowing that you're not alone. Again, it's a lifeline for people. Some powerful stuff. Sara, thank you so much for your time, your energy, your thoughtfulness, your thoughtful responses. You can tell that you are thinking this through and you want to be thoughtful. You want to be conscientious and encouraging to people. So thank you so much for today.
Thank you so much for having me, Sherry. This is a really encouraging conversation for me.
And me as well. Take care.
Thank you for your time and for sharing this experience with my guest. I hope you have found encouragement for today and a deeper revelation of God's heart in the midst of pain and suffering. We'd love to have you as a subscriber to Finding God in Our Pain so that you can be connected with all my guests as they share their personal experiences and professional knowledge about pain and suffering. And because this podcast is a division of the website A Life of Thrive, for more information and the various ways you can connect with us, please visit the website alifeofthrive.com. I look forward to sharing more transparent stories from the hearts of women who intimately know what it means to have their world flipped upside down, their authentic struggle to make sense of it, and what recovery and healing looks like. Till then, sweet woman, remember you are not alone and that God speaks the most beautiful things in the dark.